Picture this: a man rides into town expecting nothing more than supplies and a hot meal. Instead, he witnesses something that will haunt him forever: 3 young Apache girls being sold like cattle in the town square. Their eyes hold stories of unimaginable loss, their small hands bear the rope burns of captivity, and their silent tears speak louder than any scream could. What happens when a hardened cowboy's heart breaks open? What drives a man who has spent years building walls around his emotions to suddenly declare, "Enough. I'll take them," in front of a crowd of onlookers? This isn't just another Western tale. This is the true story of how 3 Apache girls became the unexpected salvation of a man who thought he was beyond saving, and how their ancient markings, sacred symbols carved into their skin, became the very lifeline that pulled him back from the edge of his own darkness. Some stories change you. This one will change how you see courage, family, and what it truly means to save someone's life. The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's horse had barely settled when he heard the commotion coming from the town square. He had ridden into Millerville expecting nothing more than a place to water his horse, grab some supplies, and maybe find a decent meal. What he found instead would change the course of his life forever. Jake was a man carved by hardship and weathered by loss. At 34, he had already buried a wife, lost a ranch to drought, and spent the last 3 years drifting from town to town, taking whatever work he could find. His withered hands told stories of cattle drives, fence repairs, and countless nights sleeping under stars that offered no comfort. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of too much sun and too little hope. He had learned to keep his head down and his heart closed. Life had taught him that caring too much only led to pain, and Jake Morrison had endured enough pain to last several lifetimes. His philosophy was simple: do the work, collect the pay, move on. No attachments, no complications, no looking back. But, as he guided his horse toward what he assumed was the local trading post, the sound of raised voices and cruel laughter made him pause. Something in the tone made his stomach tighten with a familiar dread. He had heard that particular brand of cruelty before, and it never meant anything good. The crowd had gathered near the old wooden platform that served as the town's makeshift stage for announcements and, apparently, other less savory purposes. Jake counted about 20 men, their faces showing various degrees of interest and disgust. Some were clearly locals, shopkeepers, and farmers he could identify by their clean clothes and soft hands. Others were drifters like himself, men whose very presence suggested they had nowhere better to be. At the center of the platform stood a man Jake immediately disliked. Silas Crawford was tall and thin, with the kind of pale skin that suggested he spent most of his time indoors counting money rather than earning it honestly. His black suit was too clean for this dusty town, and his smile was too wide for the business he was conducting. Everything about Crawford screamed opportunist, the kind of man who profited from other people's misery. But it wasn't Crawford who made Jake's blood run cold. It was what Crawford was selling. 3 Apache girls stood on that platform, their hands bound with rough rope, their faces bearing the stoic expression that Jake had learned meant they were holding back an ocean of fear and pain. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14, with long black hair that had been hastily braided and dark eyes that seemed to look right through the crowd as if she could will herself somewhere else entirely. The middle girl appeared to be around 12, her small frame making the rope around her wrists look even more grotesque. The youngest was barely 10, her face still round with childhood innocence that hadn't yet been completely stolen from her. What made Jake's hands clench into fists were the markings on their skin. Each girl bore traditional Apache tattoos and ceremonial scars, symbols that Jake recognized from his time working with Apache guides in Arizona Territory. These weren't just decorative markings, they were sacred symbols that told the story of their family line, their achievements, their place in the tribe's spiritual hierarchy. To see them on display like this, being used as selling points by a man like Crawford, made Jake feel sick to his stomach. Crawford was in the middle of his sales pitch, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had done this before. "Now, gentlemen, these aren't just any Apache girls. Look at these markings here," he said, pointing at the oldest girl's arm with a wooden stick like she was livestock. "These tell us they come from a chief's family. That means they've been trained in all the domestic arts, cooking, sewing, healing. They know how to work, and they know how to follow orders." The crowd murmured with what Jake interpreted as approval, and his stomach turned. He wanted to leave, to mount his horse and ride out of this godforsaken town before he did something he might regret. But his feet seemed rooted to the spot, and his eyes kept returning to the three girls who stood with such dignity despite their circumstances. The oldest girl's name, Jake would later learn, was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in her native tongue. But right now, all Jake could see was the way she kept glancing at the two younger girls, her protective instincts clear even in her helpless state. She was trying to be strong for them, trying to show them how to survive this humiliation with their spirits intact. The middle girl, whose name was Itzel meaning Rainbow Lady, kept her eyes fixed on the ground, but Jake could see her shoulders shaking slightly. She was trying not to cry, probably because she knew it would make things worse. Her small hands were clenched so tightly that Jake could see her knuckles turning white even from his distance. The youngest, later to be known to Jake as Nayeli or I Love You, was the only one who seemed to be looking directly at the crowd. Her eyes held no fear, only a burning anger that reminded Jake of a cornered wildcat. Despite her tender age, there was something fierce in her expression that suggested she was planning something, waiting for the right moment. Crawford continued his disgusting presentation. The middle one here has some fine needlework skills, look at the beadwork on her dress. She could be quite useful for any gentleman who appreciates quality craftsmanship. And, the little one, well, she's young enough to be properly trained to your specific requirements. Jake felt bile rise in his throat. He had seen enough ugliness in his lifetime, but this was different. This was organized, systematic cruelty, the kind that happened when good people did nothing and bad people were allowed to prosper. Around him, men were beginning to call out bids. $20 for the oldest one, shouted a rancher Jake didn't recognize. $15 for the middle girl, called another voice from the back of the crowd. With each bid, Jake felt something inside himself breaking apart. He thought about his late wife, Mary, and what she would say if she could see him standing here doing nothing while children were being sold like cattle. Mary had always believed that a person's worth was measured not by what they accumulated, but by what they were willing to sacrifice for others. He thought about his own childhood, growing up on a small farm where his mother had taught him that every human being deserved dignity and respect, regardless of their race or circumstances. Those lessons felt very far away right now, buried under years of disappointment and hardship, but they were still there, still part of who he was underneath all the protective layers he had built. The bidding continued, and Jake watched as the three girls' faces showed different reactions to their fate being decided by strangers. Ayana maintained her stoic expression, but Jake could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest that betrayed her fear. Itzel had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her face while she tried to make herself as small as possible. Little Nayeli continued to stare at the crowd with that fierce expression, as if she was memorizing every face for future revenge. $30 for all three, called out a voice that made Jake's skin crawl. The speaker was a man Jake had unfortunately encountered before, Buck Wheeler, known throughout the territory for his cruelty to both animals and people. Wheeler ran a remote trading post where rumors suggested things happened that decent people didn't talk about. The thought of these three girls ending up in Wheeler's hands made Jake feel physically ill. Crawford seemed pleased with the bid. $30 is generous, Mr. Wheeler, but let's see if we can't do better. These are prime specimens, after all. Look at the quality of their traditional markings, you won't find better examples of authentic Apache craftsmanship. Jake wanted to scream at the casual way Crawford discussed these girls' sacred markings as if they were decorative features rather than deeply meaningful spiritual symbols. Each tattoo and scar had been earned through ceremonies and rites of passage that connected these girls to generations of their ancestors. To reduce them to craftsmanship was an insult that went beyond simple ignorance into the realm of deliberate dehumanization. The sun was getting higher, and Jake could see sweat beginning to form on the girls' faces. They had probably been standing there for hours, put on display like goods in a store window. Their lips looked dry, and he wondered when they had last been given water. The casual cruelty of their treatment was almost as infuriating as the fact that they were being sold at all. $35, called another voice, and Jake turned to see who was bidding. It was Tom Richardson, a local businessman who Jake had heard described as respectable by the townspeople. The fact that supposedly respectable men were participating in this horror made it somehow worse. Wheeler countered immediately. $40, and that's final. I've got work for all three of them. The way Wheeler said work made Jake's blood run cold. He had heard enough stories about Wheeler's trading post to know that whatever work he had in mind had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. Crawford was about to accept Wheeler's bid when something inside Jake finally snapped. All the pain he had been carrying, all the guilt over his own failures, all the rage at a world that seemed designed to crush the innocent, it all came pouring out at once. Enough! Jake's voice cut through the crowd like a gunshot, loud enough to make everyone turn and look at him. I'll take them. The words were out of his mouth before he had fully decided to say them, but once they were spoken, Jake felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. Crawford looked surprised and pleased. Well, well. Another bidder. What's your offer, stranger? Jake reached into his saddlebags and pulled out the roll of bills that represented everything he had in the world: 3 months' wages from his last job, money he had been planning to use to buy supplies and maybe rent a room for the winter. Without hesitation, he counted out $50, more than he could really afford but less than these girls' lives were worth. $50, Jake said firmly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. Cash money, right now. The crowd murmured with surprise. $50 was more money than most of these men saw in a month, and certainly more than anyone had expected to be offered for 3 Apache girls. Wheeler's face darkened with anger. Now wait just a minute, sold. Crawford declared quickly, clearly delighted with the unexpected windfall. $50 to the gentleman in the brown hat. Jake felt as if he was watching someone else's life unfold as he walked forward and handed over his money. Crawford counted the bills carefully, then untied the ropes that bound the girls' hands. As soon as they were free, all 3 girls rubbed their wrists where the rope had left angry red marks. Pleasure doing business with you, Crawford said with a smile that made Jake want to hit him. They're your responsibility now. I recommend keeping them tied up until you get them where you're going. Apache girls are known for trying to escape. Jake looked at the 3 girls, really looked at them for the first time. Up close, he could see that their traditional markings were even more intricate than he had realized. Each symbol seemed to tell a story, and Jake found himself wondering about the ceremonies and celebrations that had accompanied their creation. These weren't just decorations, they were a written history of these girls' lives and heritage. Ayanna met his eyes directly, and Jake saw something in her gaze that surprised him. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of cautious assessment. She was trying to figure out what kind of man he was, whether he represented a better fate or just a different kind of danger. Come on, Jake said quietly, gesturing toward where his horse was tied. Let's get out of here. As they walked away from the platform, Jake could hear the crowd beginning to disperse, their entertainment apparently over. Some men were grumbling about the high price, others were speculating about what Jake planned to do with 3 Apache girls. Jake tried not to think too hard about that question himself. He had acted on instinct, driven by a moral outrage that had overridden his usual caution and self-preservation. But, now that the moment had passed, he was beginning to realize that he had no idea what came next. He had just spent his last $50 to buy the freedom of 3 girls whose language he didn't speak, whose customs he barely understood, and whose very presence with him would likely make him unwelcome in most towns between here and wherever they were going, which was another problem, since he had no idea where they were going. But, as he looked back at the 3 girls following him with cautious steps, Jake realized that for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had done something that mattered. The weight of his own failures and losses was still there, but it was somehow lighter, as if sharing the burden had made it more bearable. Whatever happened next, at least these 3 girls wouldn't be spending the night in Buck Wheeler's trading post or working for any of the other men who had been bidding on them like livestock. That had to count for something. Jake helped each girl onto his horse, then took the reins and began walking toward the edge of town. Behind them, Millerville continued its daily business as if nothing significant had happened. But Jake knew better. Something had definitely happened, something that would change all their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As they reached the outskirts of town, the oldest girl, Ayanna, spoke for the first time, her words in Apache but her meaning clear from her tone. She was asking him a question, probably wanting to know where he was taking them. Jake stopped walking and turned to face all three girls. He wished he could speak their language, wished he could explain that he hadn't bought them to use them, that he had no clear plan beyond getting them away from that horrible scene in the town square. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He took out his knife and cut a piece of rope from his saddle, then handed it to Ayanna. If she wanted to tie his hands, if that would make them feel safer, he was willing to let her do it. The three girls exchanged glances, clearly confused by this unexpected gesture. After a moment of discussion in their own language, Ayanna handed the rope back to Jake and said something that sounded almost like thank you. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jake tucked the rope away and resumed walking, leading his horse and its three precious passengers toward an uncertain future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The first night was the longest of Jake's life. He had found a sheltered spot about 5 miles from Millerville, near a small creek that would provide water and a bit of cover from the road. As the sun began to set, Jake realized he faced a problem he hadn't fully considered during his impulsive rescue. He had no idea how to communicate with 3 Apache girls who spoke little to no English. Jake had made a small fire and was trying to figure out how to divide the meager supplies in his saddlebags when Ayanna approached him. She pointed to herself and said slowly, "Ayanna." Then, she pointed to the middle girl and said, "Itzel," before indicating the youngest and saying, "Nayeli." Jake felt a surge of relief. Names were a start. He pointed to himself and said, "Jake." Then, feeling foolish but determined to try, he repeated their names back to them, doing his best to pronounce them correctly. Ayanna nodded approvingly and said something in Apache to her sisters. Jake caught the word Jake in the middle of her sentence and figured she was telling them his name. It was a small step, but it felt significant. The girls had been watching Jake carefully all evening, clearly trying to assess what kind of man he was and what he intended to do with them. Jake could understand their wariness in their experience. White men who bought Apache girls rarely had good intentions. Jake opened his saddlebags and pulled out what food he had: some dried beef, hardtack, and a few apples he had picked up in the last town. It wasn't much to split 4 ways, but it was what they had. He divided everything as evenly as he could and gestured for the girls to take their portions. Nayeli, the youngest, hung back while her older sisters accepted the food. Jake noticed she kept glancing at his gun, which was holstered at his hip. He realized that to a 10-year-old girl who had been through what she had experienced, any armed man represented potential danger. Without saying anything, Jake unbuckled his gun belt and set it down on the far side of the fire, well out of easy reach. Then, he sat down cross-legged and began eating his own meager portion, making sure to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. The gesture seemed to have the desired effect. Nayeli crept closer and accepted her share of the food, though she remained ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. As they ate, Jake found himself studying the sacred markings on the girls' arms and faces. In the firelight, the tattoos seemed to come alive, and Jake began to understand that each symbol was part of a larger story. On Ayanna's right arm, he could see what looked like a series of connected diamonds that seemed to represent some kind of family lineage. Itzel had delicate curved lines on her cheeks that resembled flowing water, while little Nayeli bore simple dots arranged in patterns that reminded Jake of constellations. Jake had worked with Apache scouts during his time in Arizona Territory, and he remembered learning that these markings were earned through ceremonies and achievements. They weren't just decoration, they were a person's spiritual resume, a visual representation of their place in the tribe's complex social and religious structure. After they had finished eating, Ayanna approached Jake again. She pointed to the markings on her arm, then said something in Apache while making gestures that Jake interpreted as either a question or an explanation. She seemed to be trying to tell him something important about the symbols, but Jake couldn't understand what. Frustrated by the language barrier, Jake got an idea. He found a stick and began drawing in the dirt near the fire. First, he drew a simple representation of the town they had left, complete with a little square for the platform where Crawford had been conducting his awful business. Then, he drew 4 stick figures, himself and the 3 girls, walking away from the town. The girls watched with interest as Jake continued his dirt drawing. He drew mountains in the distance and a question mark, trying to convey that he didn't know where they were going. Then, he pointed to each of the girls and made questioning gestures, hoping they might be able to indicate if they had family somewhere or a place they wanted to go. Ayanna studied the drawing carefully, then took the stick from Jake and added her own marks to the dirt. She drew what looked like a river, then made symbols that Jake didn't recognize but that clearly meant something important to her. She pointed northeast and said something urgently in Apache. Jake nodded to show he understood the direction, even though he had no idea what she was trying to tell him about what lay in that direction. But it was communication of a sort, and it gave him hope that they might be able to work together to figure out their next steps. That night, Jake offered the girls his bedroll while he made do with his saddle blanket. They huddled together for warmth and comfort, and Jake could hear them whispering in their own language long into the night. He wondered what they were talking about, whether they were making plans to escape, or simply trying to process everything that had happened to them. Jake slept fitfully, waking often to check on his companions and listen for signs of pursuit. He was acutely aware that taking 3 Apache girls from a legal sale, even one that had sickened him, might technically make him a thief in the eyes of the law. More immediately concerning was the possibility that Buck Wheeler or one of the other disappointed bidders might decide to follow them and take the girls by force. When Jake woke at dawn, he found that the girls were already up and had somehow managed to catch 2 rabbits, which they had prepared for cooking. Jake was impressed by their resourcefulness and skill. These weren't helpless victims, they were survivors who knew how to take care of themselves when given the opportunity. Ayanna approached Jake with one of the rabbits and, through gestures and the few English words she seemed to know, indicated that they should cook it for breakfast. Jake nodded gratefully and helped her prepare the fire while Itzel and Nayeli gathered edible plants from the surrounding area. As they shared the morning meal, Jake was struck by how normal it felt, despite the unusual circumstances. The girls seemed more relaxed than they had the previous evening, and Jake began to hope that they were starting to trust him, at least a little. After breakfast, Jake faced the question of what to do next. He had been thinking about Ayanna's drawing from the night before, the way she had pointed northeast with such urgency. Jake had spent enough time in Apache country to know that tribal territories were carefully defined and deeply meaningful to their inhabitants. If the girls had family or tribal connections in that direction, it made sense to head that way. Jake packed up their meager camp and helped the girls onto his horse again. As they resumed their journey, Jake found himself paying attention to details he might have missed before. The way Itzel kept scanning the horizon, as if she was looking for familiar landmarks. The way Nayeli would occasionally point to a bird or animal and say something in Apache that sounded like she was identifying it. The way Ayanna rode with the posture of someone who was used to being on horseback, suggesting she had grown up in a culture where horses were an important part of daily life. Around midday, they encountered their first real test. Jake heard the sound of approaching horses before he saw them, and his heart sank when he recognized Buck Wheeler's voice among the riders. Wheeler had apparently decided that $50 was too much to pay for something he thought he could get for free. Jake quickly guided his horse off the main trail and into a grove of cottonwood trees, gesturing for the girls to be quiet. Through the leaves, he could see Wheeler and 2 other men riding slowly along the trail, clearly following their tracks. "I know they came this way," Wheeler was saying. 3 Apache girls and a fool with more money than sense. When I catch up with them, I'll teach that cowboy what happens when you interfere with a man's business." Jake felt the girls tense behind him on the horse. Even without understanding English, they could probably sense the threat in Wheeler's voice and demeanor. As the men rode past their hiding spot, Jake held his breath and prayed that his horse wouldn't make any noise that might give them away. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Jake waited another 10 minutes before emerging from their hiding place, but the encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Wheeler was the kind of man who didn't give up easily, and Jake realized that staying on the main trails would be too dangerous. For the rest of the day, Jake led them through rougher country, following deer paths and creek beds that would be harder to track. It meant slower progress, but Jake figured it was worth the sacrifice in speed if it kept them safe from Wheeler and his men. That evening, as they made camp in a secluded canyon, Ayanna surprised Jake by speaking to him in broken English. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying a weight of meaning. Why had he bought them? Why had he brought them away from the town? Why was he helping them? Jake thought about how to answer. He didn't fully understand his own motivations, and even if he did, he wasn't sure he could explain them in a way that would translate across the cultural and language barriers between them. Finally, he pointed to the sacred markings on her arm and said, "Beautiful? Important." Then, he pointed back toward the direction they had come from and shook his head. "Bad men. Wrong." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, as if she was trying to look into his soul and determine whether he was telling the truth. Finally, she nodded slowly and said something to her sisters in Apache. Whatever she told them seemed to ease some of the tension that had been evident in their posture all day. For the first time since leaving Millerville, Jake saw Nayeli smile, just a little. That night, as Jake lay wrapped in his blanket looking up at the stars, he thought about the path his life had taken. 2 days ago, he had been a drifter with no purpose beyond his own survival. Now he was responsible for 3 young lives, traveling toward an unknown destination based on nothing more than a drawing in the dirt and his faith that he was doing the right thing. The weight of that responsibility was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. For the first time in years, Jake felt like his life had meaning beyond just getting through each day. These girls needed him, and, maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. Jake thought about the sacred markings that adorned their skin, symbols of a heritage and culture that men like Crawford and Wheeler saw only as exotic curiosities to be exploited. But Jake was beginning to understand that those markings represented something much deeper. They were a connection to something larger than themselves, a reminder that each person was part of a story that stretched back through generations. Maybe that was what he had been missing in his own life. Maybe his years of drifting and isolation had been caused not just by the losses he had suffered, but by his disconnection from any larger purpose or community. As sleep finally overtook him, Jake made a silent promise to the 3 girls sleeping near the dying fire. He would get them to safety, whatever that meant and wherever it might be. And, maybe, in the process, he would find something he hadn't even known he was looking for. The next morning brought new challenges and new hope. Itzel had apparently been paying close attention to their route, because she began pointing out landmarks and making comments in Apache that suggested she recognized where they were. When they reached a particular bend in a creek, she became quite excited and gestured enthusiastically toward a series of rock formations in the distance. Ayana and Nayeli seemed to share her excitement, and, for the first time since Jake had met them, all 3 girls looked genuinely hopeful. Jake didn't understand what they were seeing, but their reaction told him they were getting close to something important. As they continued northeast, following the girls' increasingly confident directions, Jake began to see signs that they were entering territory that was more familiar to his companions. The girls rode with less tension, pointing out plants and animals to each other in animated conversations that Jake couldn't understand but was happy to listen to. Whatever lay ahead, Jake felt certain that their journey together was far from over. The sacred markings on the girl's skin had become more than just symbols to him, they had become a map leading towards something that might save them all. 3 days after their escape from Wheeler and his men, Jake and the 3 Apache girls crested a hill that revealed a sight that made Jake's blood run cold. In the valley below lay the charred remains of what had once been an Apache village. Even from a distance, Jake could see the blackened circles where homes had stood, the scattered bones of livestock, and the eerie silence that hung over the destruction like a shroud. Ayana let out a cry that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. She slid down from the horse and ran toward the ruins, with Itzel and Nayeli close behind. Jake followed, his heart heavy with the realization that he was about to witness something that would explain why these 3 girls had been for sale in Millerville's town square. The village had been burned sometime within the past few months, Jake estimated from the condition of the remains. This wasn't the work of raiders or rival tribes, the systematic destruction spoke of military action, probably cavalry units carrying out what they euphemistically called pacification operations in Apache territory. Jake watched as the 3 girls moved through the ruins with the familiarity of people returning home. They knew exactly where each structure had stood, could identify specific families' homes from the scattered belongings that had survived the flames. Their movements were both reverent and desperate, as if they were searching for something specific among the devastation. Ayana found at first a partially collapsed structure that had once been larger than the others, probably the home of a chief or spiritual leader. She called out to her sisters and Apache, her voice breaking with emotion, and they hurried to join her. Together, they began carefully moving aside charred timbers and debris, working with the focused intensity of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. Jake wanted to help, but he sensed that this was something the girls needed to do themselves. Instead, he kept watch, scanning the surrounding hills for any signs of Wheeler or other threats while the girls conducted their heartbreaking search. After nearly an hour of careful excavation, Nayeli let out a sharp cry of discovery. She had found something buried beneath a collapsed section of wall, a bundle wrapped in what had once been beautifully decorated hide but was now scorched and damaged by fire and weather. The three girls gathered around the bundle with an reverence that told Jake this was something precious beyond measure. With trembling hands, Ayana unwrapped the outer layers of hide to reveal contents that made all three girls gasp with joy and relief. Inside the bundle were items that Jake recognized as sacred objects: eagle feathers, carved bone instruments, small bags that probably contained ceremonial herbs, and, most importantly, what appeared to be a collection of painted hide strips covered with symbols and markings that matched those on the girl's skin. Jake realized he was looking at something like a family Bible or historical record, a collection of stories and spiritual instructions that had been passed down through generations. The fact that someone had taken the time to hide and protect these items during the attack suggested they held enormous importance to the community that had lived here. Ayana held up one of the painted strips and showed it to her sisters, pointing to specific symbols and speaking rapidly in Apache. Jake could see tears streaming down all their faces, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Whatever they had found in that bundle had given them something they desperately needed. As the girls continued to examine their recovered treasures, Jake walked through the rest of the ruined village, trying to piece together what had happened here. The pattern of destruction suggested a surprise attack, probably at dawn when most people would have been sleeping. Some structures showed evidence of hasty attempts at defense, but the attacking force had clearly been overwhelming. Jake found evidence that some villagers had escaped, trails leading away from the village that showed signs of people fleeing on foot, carrying whatever they could manage. But he also found graves, hastily dug and marked with Apache symbols, where the survivors had buried their dead before fleeing to safer territory. When Jake returned to where the girls were still examining their recovered artifacts, he found them engaged in what appeared to be a ceremony. They had arranged the sacred objects in a specific pattern on a clean piece of hide, and Ayana was chanting in a low voice while making precise gestures with her hands. Jake stood at a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude on something that was clearly private and sacred. But, as he watched, he began to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't just a religious ritual, it was a reunion. These girls were reconnecting with their heritage, their family history, their very identity in a way that had been denied to them during their captivity. The chanting continued for nearly an hour, with each girl taking turns to speak or sing in their native language. Jake didn't understand the words, but he could feel the power and emotion in their voices. This was healing of a kind that went beyond the physical. This was the restoration of spirits that had been nearly broken by trauma and loss. When the ceremony concluded, Ayana approached Jake with something in her hands, one of the painted hide strips from the bundle. She held it out to him and began speaking in a mixture of Apache and broken English, clearly trying to explain something important. Jake could see that the hide contained a map of sorts, with symbols marking rivers, mountains, and other geographical features. But, more than that, it seemed to be a genealogical chart, showing family connections and tribal relationships across a wide territory. Ayana pointed to specific symbols on the map while saying names in Apache, then pointed to the markings on her own arm and her sisters' faces. Jake began to understand that she was showing him how their sacred markings connected them to specific families and locations marked on the map. This wasn't just a map, it was a guide to relatives and allies who might still be alive, scattered across Apache territory but connected by the same spiritual and family ties that were recorded in the sacred markings on the girl's skin. Jake studied the map more carefully, trying to correlate its symbols with his own knowledge of the territory's geography. One location in particular seemed to be marked with special significance, a place near what Jake recognized as the Gila River, marked with symbols that appeared repeatedly throughout the genealogical information. Ayana noticed where Jake was looking and nodded emphatically. She pointed to the location on the map, then to herself and her sisters, then made gestures that Jake interpreted as indicating travel or journey. She was telling him that they needed to go there, that this place represented safety or family or home. Jake examined the route more carefully and estimated it would take them at least 2 weeks of hard travel through country that was both physically challenging and potentially dangerous. The territory between their current location and the Gila River was known for its harsh desert conditions, limited water sources, and the ongoing military operations that had apparently destroyed this village. But, as Jake looked at the three girls, saw the hope and determination in their eyes, he knew there was really no choice to be made. These girls had lost their home, their community, probably most of their family. If there was a chance that relatives or tribal allies were waiting at that location marked on the sacred map, then that was where they needed to go. Jake nodded and pointed to the location on the map, then to himself and the girls, trying to communicate his agreement with their plan. The relief and gratitude in their faces made any concerns about the danger and difficulty of the journey seem unimportant. As they prepared to leave the ruined village, Jake watched the girls perform one final ceremony. They gathered stones from around the village and built a small cairn, placing some of the sacred objects they had recovered on top as an offering or memorial. Ayanna spoke words in Apache that Jake didn't understand but that clearly carried great significance. Then, with great care, the girls rewrapped the remaining sacred objects and tucked the bundle securely into Jake's saddlebags. The trust implicit in this action wasn't lost on Jake. They were placing their most precious possessions, the very symbols of their identity and heritage, in his keeping. As they rode away from the destroyed village, Jake found himself thinking about the profound change that had occurred in his relationship with these three girls. When he had first bought them from Crawford's auction, he had been driven by simple moral outrage and a desire to prevent them from falling into Buck Wheeler's hands. But, now, having witnessed their connection to these sacred objects and their desperate hope of reuniting with surviving family members, Jake realized that his responsibility went far beyond simple rescue. He was now the guardian of not just 3 lives, but of an entire cultural heritage that was embodied in the sacred markings on their skin and the precious objects they carried. The symbols that Crawford had callously described as decorative craftsmanship were actually a living library of stories, genealogies, and spiritual practices that connected these girls to generations of ancestors and to relatives who might still be alive somewhere in the vast territory ahead. The weight of this responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. Jake had spent the past 3 years of his life avoiding meaningful connections and commitments, telling himself that isolation was the safest path after losing his wife and ranch. But these 3 Apache girls had somehow drawn him into something much larger than himself, a journey that seemed to be as much about his own spiritual recovery as about their physical safety. That evening, as they made camp in a hidden canyon several miles from the ruined village, Jake noticed a change in the girls' behavior toward him. They no longer watched him with the wary suspicion that had characterized their first days together. Instead, they included him in their evening routines in small but significant ways. Itzel brought him water when she filled the containers for herself and her sisters. Nayeli shared some wild berries she had found, making sure Jake received his portion before taking her own. Most significantly, Ayanna began teaching him Apache words for common objects and actions, patiently repeating each word until Jake could pronounce it to her satisfaction. The language lessons became a nightly ritual, and Jake found himself looking forward to these sessions not just for their practical value but for the sense of connection they created. Each new word he learned felt like a small bridge being built between his world and theirs, a sign that communication and understanding were possible even across vast cultural differences. 3 nights after leaving the village, Jake had his first real conversation with Ayanna using a combination of Apache words, English phrases, and gestures. She told him about the village where she had grown up, about the ceremonies where she and her sisters had received their sacred markings, about the morning when the soldiers had come and changed everything forever. Jake learned that the girls had been captured during their escape from the burning village. Their parents had sent them running toward the hills while trying to hold off the attackers, and the girls had made it several miles before being caught by cavalry scouts. They had spent weeks in military custody before being turned over to men like Crawford, who specialized in disposing of surplus Apache prisoners through private sales. The casual brutality of this system shocked Jake, even though he had seen enough of the world to know that such things happened. The idea that children could be separated from their families and sold to the highest bidder as if they were livestock represented a level of systematic cruelty that made Jake feel ashamed to be part of a society that allowed such practices. But, as Ayana continued her story, Jake began to understand something that gave him hope. The sacred markings on the girl's skin weren't just decorative or genealogical, they were also practical. Each symbol contained information about safe places, friendly contacts, and family connections that could be activated by anyone who knew how to read the code. The map they had recovered from the village wasn't just showing them where to find relatives, it was showing them how to use their sacred markings as a kind of passport that would identify them to other Apache groups as legitimate members of specific families and clans. In a culture where family and tribal connections determined everything from marriage possibilities to access to resources, these markings represented survival itself. Jake began to realize that his role in this journey was more complex than he had initially understood. He wasn't just helping 3 girls find their relatives, he was participating in the preservation and continuation of an entire cultural system that was under attack from forces much larger than Buck Wheeler or Silas Crawford. As Jake lay in his bedroll that night, listening to the soft murmur of the girls talking among themselves in their own language, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own needs and desires. For the first time since Mary's death, Jake felt like his life had meaning that connected him to something larger than his own pain and loss. The sacred markings on the girl's skin had become more than symbols to him. They had become a reminder that every person carried within themselves a story that connected them to past generations and future possibilities. Jake's own story had seemed broken and meaningless for so long, but maybe, just maybe, it was actually part of a larger narrative that he simply hadn't been able to see before. Tomorrow they would continue their journey toward the Gila River and whatever awaited them there. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison fell asleep feeling like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The desert between the ruined village and the Gila River proved to be more treacherous than Jake had anticipated. What had looked like a straightforward 2-week journey on the sacred map became a grueling test of endurance that pushed all 4 travelers to their physical and emotional limits. By the end of their first week in the desert, Jake's horse was showing signs of serious strain. The animal had never been intended to carry 4 people across such difficult terrain, and Jake could see that they would need to find an alternative soon or risk losing their only means of transportation entirely. The girls had proven to be remarkably resilient travelers, never complaining about the harsh conditions or the meager rations Jake was able to provide. But Jake could see the toll the journey was taking on them. Nayeli, the youngest, had developed a persistent cough that worried Jake, especially since their water supplies were running dangerously low. Itzel had injured her foot on the rocky terrain and was trying to hide her limp, though Jake could see the pain in her face with each step. Even Ayana, who had shown such strength and leadership throughout their journey, looked exhausted and thin. It was Ayana who made the decision that changed everything. On the morning of their 8th day in the desert, she approached Jake with the bundle of sacred objects and began speaking in a mixture of Apache and English, clearly trying to communicate something of vital importance. Through gestures and the limited vocabulary they now shared, Jake gradually understood what Ayana was proposing. She wanted to use one of the sacred markings on her arm to seek help from other Apache groups they might encounter. But this wasn't a simple matter of asking for assistance, it would involve revealing their family identity and clan affiliations to strangers, something that could be either salvation or disaster depending on the complex web of tribal politics and alliances. Jake studied the map again, trying to understand what Ayana was showing him. According to the genealogical information recorded on the sacred hides, there should be several smaller Apache groups in this area, relatives or allies who might be willing to provide aid if approached correctly. But approaching them wrong, or encountering hostile groups, could mean capture or worse for all of them. The decision was complicated by Jake's presence. As a white man traveling with 3 Apache girls, he represented a potential threat to any group they might encounter. His intentions might be honorable, but how could he prove that to people who had every reason to distrust white men on sight? Ayana seemed to understand Jake's concerns, because she began explaining something that stunned him with its implications. According to the sacred traditions recorded in their family objects, there was a ritual that could make Jake a temporary member of their family group, not through adoption or marriage, but through a spiritual bond that would allow him to travel under their protection rather than as their captor. The ritual would involve marking Jake's skin with specific symbols that would identify him as a protector and ally rather than an enemy. It would be temporary, lasting only until they reached their destination, but it would allow them to approach other Apache groups without Jake being seen as a threat. Jake's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of marking his skin with Apache symbols felt like a form of deception, a way of claiming a connection to a culture that wasn't his own. But, as he looked at the three girls, Nayeli fighting back coughs, Itzel trying to hide her pain, Ayana bearing the weight of responsibility for all their survival, Jake realized that his personal comfort was far less important than their lives. He nodded his agreement to Ayana's proposal, and she began preparations for the ritual with the solemnity of someone who understood the spiritual significance of what they were about to do. Using materials from the sacred bundle and pigments she created from desert plants and stones, Ayana began the process of marking Jake's left arm with symbols that would temporarily identify him as a member of their family group. The process was painful, the pigments burned as they were worked into small cuts in his skin, but Jake endured it without complaint. As Ayana worked, she explained the meaning of each symbol in the limited English she knew. The first mark identified him as a protector of children, the second indicated his temporary status as a family member, and the third was a symbol of safe passage that would be recognized by allied groups throughout Apache territory. The most significant marking was saved for last. A symbol that Ayana explained with great seriousness was only given to those who had proven their willingness to sacrifice everything for the protection of Apache children. This marking would carry weight with any traditional Apache group they encountered, but it also came with serious obligations and responsibilities. When the marking ritual was complete, Jake looked down at his arm and saw symbols that matched those on the girl's skin. The immediate physical transformation was less important than what it represented. Jake had been formally accepted as a temporary member of their family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. The transformation in their group dynamic was immediate and profound. The girls no longer looked to Jake as an outsider who was helping them, they now treated him as a family member with equal say in their decisions and equal claim to their protection and loyalty. That afternoon, their new status was put to the test when they encountered their first Apache scouts since leaving the ruined village. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as three mounted warriors approached their small group, their faces showing the cautious hostility he had expected. But, when the lead scout saw the markings on Jake's arm and spoke briefly with Ayana in rapid Apache, the entire tone of the encounter changed. After a short conversation that Jake couldn't follow, the scout dismounted and embraced Ayana as if greeting a long-lost relative. Through Ayana's translation, Jake learned that these scouts were from a group that had historical ties to the girl's family. They had been ranging through this area looking for survivors from various destroyed villages, and they were overjoyed to find three children from a family they had feared was completely lost. The scouts provided them with fresh water, food, and, most importantly, horses to replace Jake's exhausted mount. But, more than that, they provided information about the area they were trying to reach and the political situation they would face when they got there. The news was both good and bad. The location marked on their sacred map was indeed a gathering place for Apache survivors from multiple destroyed villages. Extended family members and clan allies were establishing a new community there, and the girls would likely find relatives who had escaped from other raids and attacks. However, the area was also being watched by military units who were trying to prevent Apache groups from consolidating. Any large gathering of Apache people was seen as a potential threat by the territorial authorities, and there had already been several confrontations between the survivors trying to rebuild and the soldiers trying to disperse them. The scouts warned Jake that his presence at the gathering place might create additional complications. Even with his sacred markings, some of the survivors might view any white man with suspicion, especially if they had recently lost family members to cavalry attacks. But the scouts also offered a solution. They were part of a network that was helping Apache survivors navigate to safe locations through routes that avoided military patrols. If Jake and the girls were willing to trust them, the scouts could guide them to the gathering place through paths that would minimize both the danger of military encounter and the risk of Jake's presence causing problems with suspicious survivors. Jake looked to Ayana for guidance, since this was ultimately her decision to make. After a brief discussion with her sisters in Apache, she nodded her agreement to the scouts' proposal. That night, as they camped with the scouts, Jake experienced something he had never expected: acceptance into a community that he had always thought of as fundamentally foreign to his own experience. The Apache scouts treated him with the same casual familiarity they showed to Ayanna and her sisters, including him in their conversations and decision-making as if his temporary family status was completely natural. One of the scouts, a man named Nailnish who spoke excellent English, explained to Jake the significance of the markings he now bore. "These symbols mean you have chosen to put Apache children above your own safety," Nailnish said. "That is not something our people take lightly. You are now responsible for their well-being not just until you reach the gathering place, but for as long as you carry those marks." Jake asked what would happen to his markings when they reached their destination, and Nailnish smiled. "That will depend on what the elders decide, and on what you choose. The temporary marks can be removed with ceremony, or they can be made permanent if all parties agree. But that is a decision for another day." As Jake lay in his bedroll that night, he thought about how much his life had changed since that day in Millerville when he had impulsively bought 3 Apache girls from Silas Crawford's auction. He had started that day as a drifter with no purpose beyond his own survival. Now he bore sacred markings on his skin that connected him to a culture and community he was still learning to understand. The physical markings were healing well, but Jake could feel that something deeper was changing too. The walls he had built around his heart after Mary's death were slowly crumbling, replaced by connections and obligations that felt both foreign and surprisingly natural. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge when Nayeli's cough worsened significantly. What had seemed like a minor irritation from the desert dust was clearly developing into something more serious. The youngest girl was running a fever, and Jake could hear a wheeze in her breathing that made him extremely worried. Nailnish examined Nayeli with the experienced eye of someone who had dealt with illness in the field, and his expression grew grave. "She needs medicine and rest," he told Jake. "There is a woman at the gathering place who knows the old healing ways, but we are still 3 days away, and the child may not have 3 days." Ayanna overheard this conversation and immediately began digging through the bundle of sacred objects they had recovered from the village. She pulled out several small bags of dried herbs and began preparing a remedy using techniques that Jake watched with fascination and admiration. As Ayanna worked, Nailnish explained to Jake what he was witnessing. The sacred markings on these girls don't just show their family history, they also indicate their training in various skills. Ayanna's markings show that she was being trained as a healer before the village was destroyed. She knows things that most white doctors have never heard of. Jake watched as Ayanna carefully measured herbs and mixed them with water heated over their small fire. She was working with the focused concentration of someone who had been well trained in these techniques, her movements precise and confident despite her obvious worry about her youngest sister. The medicine Ayanna prepared seemed to help Nayeli's breathing almost immediately. The wheeze in her chest subsided, and her fever broke within hours. But the incident had shaken Jake's confidence in their ability to complete the journey safely. It was Itzel who provided the solution. Despite her injured foot, she insisted that she was strong enough to walk if it would allow Nayeli to ride more comfortably. The scouts contributed a travois that could be pulled by one of their horses, creating a more stable platform for the sick child. As they resumed their journey toward the Gila River gathering place, Jake reflected on how the various crises they had faced had strengthened rather than weakened their group bonds. Each challenge had required them to rely more heavily on each other, to share skills and resources, to trust each other with their most vulnerable moments. The sacred markings on his arm were still tender, but Jake was beginning to understand that they represented more than just a temporary convenience for safe passage. They were a visible symbol of his transformation from an isolated drifter into someone who was connected to other people in ways that created both obligations and possibilities. 3 days later, when they finally crested the hill that revealed the Gila River gathering place in the valley below, Jake felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The settlement was larger than he had expected, dozens of traditional Apache structures mixed with more temporary shelters, clear evidence that survivors from multiple destroyed communities had found their way here. But, as they rode down toward the settlement, Jake could also see the evidence of the precarious situation these people faced. Armed sentries watched the approaches, ready to alert the community to any threats. The structures themselves were built in locations that could be easily defended or quickly abandoned if necessary. Ayanna pointed to specific sections of the settlement and spoke rapidly to Nailnish, who translated for Jake. She recognizes family signs and clan markings in the settlement layout, he explained. There are definitely relatives here, probably including some she thought were dead. As they approached the outskirts of the settlement, Jake felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. These sacred markings on his arm had gotten him this far, but now came the real test. Would this community of Apache survivors accept a white man as a legitimate protector of 3 of their children, or would his presence create the kind of problems that could endanger everyone? Jake looked at Ayanna, Itzel, and little Nayeli, and felt a surge of determination. Whatever happened next, he would not let these girls down. The sacred markings on his skin had become more than symbols, they had become a promise that he intended to keep, no matter what the cost. The gathering place beside the Gila River was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. As their small party descended into the valley, he could see that this wasn't just a refugee camp, it was a carefully planned community where survivors from numerous destroyed Apache villages were working together to preserve their culture while adapting to an increasingly dangerous world. The settlement's layout followed traditional Apache principles, with family groups arranged according to clan relationships and sacred directions. But Jake could also see innovations that spoke to the community's determination to survive: hidden storage areas for supplies, multiple escape routes, and defensive positions that could be quickly manned if soldiers appeared on the horizon. Their arrival created immediate excitement. Ayanna had been scanning the settlement as they approached, and suddenly, she let out a cry of joy and pointed toward a group of structures near the river. Jake could see people emerging from the buildings, shading their eyes against the sun as they tried to identify the approaching riders. When recognition dawned, the response was overwhelming. Women began ululating with joy while men shouted greetings in Apache. Children ran toward them, and Jake could see tears streaming down the faces of people who had clearly given up hope of ever seeing these 3 girls again. Ayanna slid down from her horse and ran toward an elderly woman who was rushing toward them with arms outstretched. The reunion between grandmother and granddaughter was so intense that Jake had to look away, feeling like an intruder on a moment too precious for outsiders to witness. Itzel and Nayeli were quickly surrounded by relatives Jake hadn't even known existed: aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends who had escaped from various destroyed villages and made their way to this safe haven. The joy of these reunions was tempered by the obvious grief for those who hadn't survived, but Jake could see that the recovery of these 3 girls represented hope for the entire community. As the initial excitement of the reunion subsided, Jake became aware that he was the focus of considerable attention from the adult men in the community. His sacred markings had been noted, and he could see discussions taking place as people tried to understand exactly who he was and how he fit into this situation. Nelnish stepped forward to introduce Jake and explain his role in bringing the girls safely to the settlement. Jake couldn't understand the Apache words being spoken, but he could tell from the tone and body language that his presence was creating some debate within the community. Finally, an elderly man who was clearly a person of considerable authority approached Jake directly. He spoke in excellent English, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was accustomed to making life and death decisions for his people. "I am Geronimo's brother, Jew," the man said, studying Jake's face with intense eyes. "Nelnish tells us that you carry the marks of a child protector, but these are sacred symbols that are not given lightly to outsiders. Tell us your story, and let us judge whether you are worthy of the trust these marks represent." Jake felt the weight of the entire community's attention as he began to tell his story. He started with that day in Millerville when he had seen 3 Apache girls being sold like livestock, and continued through their journey to the ruined village, the recovery of the sacred objects, and the long desert crossing that had brought them here. As Jake spoke, he noticed that Ayanna had positioned herself where she could see his face, and she was nodding or adding comments in Apache that seemed to confirm his account. Her grandmother and other relatives were also listening intently, clearly trying to assess whether this white man could be trusted with the safety of their recovered children. When Jake finished his story, Joe studied him in silence for a long moment before speaking. "The markings on your arm were applied by Ayanna, who learned the healing and marking arts from her mother before the village was destroyed. But these markings carry obligations that extend beyond the immediate journey. Are you prepared to honor those obligations?" Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him, Apache survivors who had lost so much but were still fighting to preserve their way of life. He thought about the 3 girls who had somehow become more important to him than his own safety, and about the journey that had transformed him from an isolated drifter into someone who was connected to something larger than himself. I am prepared, Jake said simply. Ju nodded slowly, then began speaking in Apache to the assembled community. Jake could tell that some kind of formal decision was being made, and he waited nervously for the translation. The council has decided that your actions prove you are worthy of the markings you bear, Nailnish explained to Jake. But there is a question that must be answered. The temporary markings can be removed, freeing you from the obligations they represent. Or they can be made permanent, making you a true member of this family group with all the responsibilities that entails. The choice is yours, but you must choose now. Jake felt the weight of this decision settling on his shoulders. Making the markings permanent would mean committing himself to these people and their struggle in ways he was only beginning to understand. But, as he looked at Ayana, Itzel, and Nayeli, healthy and safe and surrounded by loving relatives they had feared were lost forever, Jake realized there was really no choice to be made. Make them permanent, Jake said. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced. As the sun set over the Gila River, the entire community gathered to witness the ritual that would transform Jake's temporary markings into permanent symbols of his commitment to Apache children and their protection. The ceremony was conducted by Ayana's grandmother, a woman whose sacred markings covered most of her arms and indicated her status as a master of traditional spiritual practices. Using techniques passed down through generations, she worked additional symbols into Jake's existing markings, each one carrying specific meaning and obligation. As the ritual progressed, Jake felt something profound shifting inside himself. The physical pain of the marking process was nothing compared to the emotional transformation he was experiencing. The walls he had built around his heart after Mary's death were finally crumbling completely, replaced by connections that felt both ancient and completely new. When the marking ceremony was complete, Ju addressed Jake as a formal member of their community. You are now bound to us as we are bound to you, he said. Your obligations are simple but absolute: to protect Apache children wherever you find them, to preserve our ways whenever possible, and to serve as a bridge between our people and the white world when necessary. Jake nodded his acceptance of these obligations, feeling their weight settling onto his shoulders like a mantle he was proud to wear. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Jake was introduced to dozens of community members, each of whom treated him with the casual acceptance reserved for family. Children who had been shy around him at first gradually warmed up, drawn by the obvious affection that Ayana, Itzel, and Nayeli showed toward their protector. During the festivities, Jake learned more about the community he had joined. The gathering place was intended to be temporary, a safe location where scattered Apache survivors could reunite and reorganize before moving to more permanent settlements. But the community was also serving as a center for preserving Apache culture and traditions that were under attack throughout the territory. The sacred objects that Jake and the girls had recovered from the ruined village were contributing to this preservation effort. The genealogical information recorded on the painted hides was helping survivors locate relatives and re-establish clan relationships. The spiritual artifacts were being used to train young people in traditional practices that might otherwise be lost. Jake realized that his role in preserving these objects during their journey had made him a participant in something much larger than a simple rescue mission. He had helped preserve the cultural heritage that would allow this community to maintain its identity even while adapting to a changing world. As the celebration wound down, Jake found himself sitting by the river with Ayana, Itzel, and Nayeli. The three girls who had been strangers to him just weeks ago now felt like the family he had never thought he would have again. Ayana showed Jake the new markings on his arm, explaining their meaning in the mix of Apache and English that had become their common language. The symbols told a story that would be readable by any Apache person they encountered. Jake Morrison, the white man who had sacrificed everything to protect three Apache girls and had chosen to join their people permanently rather than abandon them once they were safe. These marks mean you can never go back to being who you were before, Ayana said seriously. You are Apache now, with all that means. Jake looked at the markings on his arm, then at the three girls who had somehow saved his life by allowing him to save theirs. I don't want to go back, he said. This is who I was meant to be. The next morning brought news that tested Jake's new commitment immediately. Scouts reported that a cavalry unit was approaching the valley, apparently drawn by reports of a large Apache gathering. The community would need to disperse quickly to avoid a confrontation that could destroy everything they had worked to build. Jake found himself automatically included in the council of war that met to plan the community's response. His intimate knowledge of military tactics and white culture made him a valuable advisor as the leadership worked to develop a strategy that would protect their people while preserving as much as possible of what they had accomplished here. The plan they developed was complex and dangerous. The community would split into smaller groups and scatter to predetermined meeting points, carrying their most precious possessions and cultural artifacts with them. Jake would play a crucial role as a liaison with the military unit, using his status as a white man to deflect suspicion while the evacuation proceeded. As the plan unfolded, Jake realized that this was exactly the kind of situation his permanent markings had prepared him for. He was no longer just protecting Ayanna, Itzel, and Nayeli, he was now responsible for helping preserve the safety and culture of an entire Apache community. The evacuation proceeded smoothly, with Jake successfully convincing the cavalry captain that the settlement was just a temporary trading post rather than a permanent Apache community. By the time the soldiers realized the true nature of what they had found, most of the residents had already melted away into the desert, carrying their cultural treasures and spiritual practices with them to new locations where they could continue the work of preservation and survival. 6 months later, Jake found himself living in a hidden canyon settlement where Apache survivors were building a new kind of community, one that preserved traditional ways while adapting to the realities of a changing world. His role as a bridge between cultures had become formalized, and he regularly served as a negotiator and translator when the community needed to interact with white authorities or traders. The 3 girls who had changed his life were thriving in their new home. Ayanna had resumed her training as a healer and was becoming known throughout the region for her skill with traditional Apache medicine. Itzel had discovered a talent for diplomacy and often accompanied Jake on his negotiation missions. Nayeli, now 12 and growing tall, was being trained as a scout and had already demonstrated the same fierce courage that had impressed Jake during their first meeting. But, perhaps more importantly, Jake had found something he had never expected, a sense of belonging that went deeper than anything he had experienced even during his marriage to Mary. The sacred markings on his skin were no longer just symbols of obligation, they had become part of his identity in ways that made his previous life seem like it had belonged to someone else entirely. One evening, as Jake sat by the fire teaching Apache words to children who had been born into the community since the settlement's founding, Ayanna approached him with a question that made him smile. "Do you ever regret that day in Millerville?" she asked. "Do you ever wish you had just ridden on and left us to our fate?" Jake looked around at the thriving community they had helped create, at the children who were learning traditional Apache ways alongside new skills that would help them navigate a changing world, at the 3 young women who had become the daughters he had never known he wanted. "No," he said firmly. "That was the day my real life began." The sacred markings on Jake's skin had indeed become his lifeline, not just a symbol of his connection to Apache culture, but the visible representation of his transformation from a man running from his past into someone who had found his true purpose in preserving the future. As the stars came out over their hidden valley, Jake Morrison, now known throughout Apache territory as the white man with sacred markings who had chosen to become one of their own, felt a peace he had never known was possible. He had saved 3 Apache girls from a terrible fate, but, in the process, they had saved him from something even worse, a life without meaning, connection, or hope. The markings on their skin had become more than decoration or identification, they had become the map to a shared destiny none of them could have imagined when they first met in that dusty town square so many months ago. And, as Jake looked at his own marked arm in the firelight, he knew that some scars were not reminders of pain, but proof of healing that ran deeper than the skin itself.